Welcome to Congress in Context.
Today, we are really cracking open the congressional record. We're trying to cut straight through the headlines to find out what Washington, D.C. was actually focused on this week.
And the contradictions are, well, they're pretty startling, aren't they?
They really are.
That's our whole mission with this deep dive, to synthesize the latest congressional activity. We're not just looking at the heated floor debates, which were incredibly intense this week.
Oh, absolutely. Especially on healthcare.
And foreign policy.
No.
But we're also digging into something that often gets overlooked, the extensions of remarks, the EOR.
And that's so crucial because that's where the local priorities really live. And it gets right to the heart of this week's record, which is this striking contrast.
It's like two different Congresses operating at the same time.
Exactly. On one hand, you have this just maximum partisan conflict, bitter existential disagreements over healthcare, immigration, social policy.
But then you flip the page in the very same official record, and you find a completely different reality. You find a Congress that's focused on routine, heartfelt, and, deeply bipartisan recognitions for local heroes and community projects.
It's almost like two separate governments. So today, we're going to break down those huge legislative battles. We'll spotlight those local impacts you can only find in the EOR.
And this is really important for you, the listener. We're going to pull back the curtain on how Congress actually functions. We'll look at one key procedural move, the legislative hold, and how it can just quietly kill or fast-track a bill.
There is a lot to get through.
There is. So we want to take our time and give these complex issues the context they deserve. Let's start right at the top with that staggering contrast we're calling the dual realities of Capitol Hill.
The contrast was, it was palpable this week. It started with this really powerful session dedicated to recognizing the former members of Congress, the FMC.
Right, and these events are usually a moment for some institutional reflection, but this year the tone felt different.
It felt deeply concerned.
Sobering is the word that comes to mind. The session talked about the former members who attended, their, continued sense of duty. But the message they brought wasn't just nostalgic. It was a warning.
A grave warning. They talked about the current state of polarization and division being potentially, and this is a quote, more challenging right now than it was since the time of the Civil War.
Think about that. The Civil War.
That is a staggering comparison.
Yeah.
You have people who served through the Cold War, Vietnam, Watergate, multiple impeachments.
Right.
And they look at today's political environment and they invoke the Civil War. That tells you they see a fundamental, a structural decay in the health of the institution itself.
It's not just that they disagree on policy.
No, it's an inability to even engage productively. They specifically pointed to social media attacks on the system, which they said make it incredibly difficult for members to just get along or maintain any kind of personal respect.
The idea being, if you believe the person across the aisle isn't just wrong, but is actually evil or corrupt, how can you possibly compromise? The whole mechanism just breaks down.
They didn't leave it all as doom and gloom, though. They did have some hope. They recalled a movement from back in January 2017, the 115th Congress.
The Honor and Civility document.
That's the one, signed by all 53 freshmen, Republicans, and Democrats.
And what's so fascinating about that is it wasn't a policy proposal. It was a moral one. It was a declaration.
Exactly. The core idea was to explicitly state that the person on the other side of the aisle is not your enemy. They're a fellow American, a colleague.
It's that foundational belief that has to come first before you can even start talking about policy.
And they gave some positive examples to show that it can still work. A former member talked about learning from his uncle, Dale Kildee, that you can fight hard for the positions you believe in.
Like you do it with dignity.
And you treat your opponents with respect. The fight is intellectual, not personal.
There was that other story, too, that really just crystallizes how it's supposed to work. A former member needed help for a project in his hometown.
And he was in the minority at the time.
Right. And he got help from a friend across the aisle, Fred Upton. But it wasn't just him. Speaker Ryan and then later Pelosi both worked together to make it happen.
Which is a perfect testament to the idea that deep relationships and just, basic institutional courtesy can matter more than your party rank.
Okay, so let's hang on to that idea of polarization for a second and switch to the complete opposite reality that was happening at the very same time.
In the extensions of remarks.
Exactly. The part of the record where members submit written statements, usually about local stuff. And there you see this incredibly compassionate picture.
This is the side of Congress that I think balances out the intensity we see on the floor. For instance, Mrs. Stansbury submitted this really heartfelt tribute to a woman named Letty Bellin.
She was recognizing her work on, what was it, Western water?
Western water, tribal water rights, land protection. But what really stood out wasn't just the policy work, it was the focus on her personal qualities, her laugh, her kindness, and her compassion.
Even when she was tackling these really tough, often zero-sum policy fights.
Then you had Mrs. FOXX, who stood up to recognize Donna Autry, and she just called her a real hero and a dear friend.
It's in these EOR statements where the ideology seems to just vanish, gets replaced by this appreciation for community impact, for service.
And they're almost always non-controversial because they focus on shared values: service, duty, local achievement, things that are just easier to agree on than, who gets what slice of the national budget.
Even the opening prayer from Chaplain Kivin sort of reflected this duality.
It did. It started by focusing on consolation for people of faith who are troubled by events targeting believers, but then it pivoted directly to the need for civility right there in the chamber.
Asking that members do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, and instead look not to our own interests, but to the interests of others, a direct call for cooperation.
So the main takeaway here, for you, the listener, is that the Congressional Record proves that while the media is focused on this maximum partisan division—
Which is real, to be clear.
Oh, it's very real. But the actual human machinery of Congress still holds this formal space for civility and local goodwill. The problem isn't that civility is extinct.
It's just that it's been compartmentalized. It's relegated to these non-policy items, like the EOR, while the high-stakes stuff remains completely poisoned by polarization.
And it is hard to reconcile that spirit with what came next.
The legislative warfare that immediately followed on the House floor. Let's get into the first big battle. Healthcare.
Right. The House spent a serious amount of time on the Affordable Care Act, the ACA. And to get the fight, you first have to understand the procedure.
It started with a rule.
Always does. HRES 953. This was the rule for considering HR 6703, which Republicans titled the Lower Healthcare Premiums for All Americans Act.
The title alone tells you everything. This was a direct assault on the ACA framework, which Republicans love to call the Unaffordable Care Act.
And they came with stats to back that up. They framed the system as a failure, claiming that since the ACA was enacted, costs have just ballooned. They cited a 25% premium increase over just the last 5 years.
Their core argument wasn't about subsidies, though. It was about market reform.
Exactly. They argued against the current structure, which they see as just throwing more taxpayer money at big insurance companies. HR 6703 was their alternative, focused on competition and transparency to root out hidden costs.
Okay, so if I'm trying to follow along here, the technical details really matter. Can we break down what those market reforms in HR 6703 actually were?
Absolutely. The bill really focuses on three main things. First, pharmacy transparency. The goal is to force these middlemen, the PBMs, to disclose their true costs and bring down drug prices.
Okay, that's one.
Second, and this is a big one, it expands access to something called associated health plans, or AHPs.
Let's pause on AHPs. What are they and why are they so contentious?
Well, think of it like this. It lets small businesses or even independent workers, all the plumbers in a state or all the freelance writers nationwide.
People in the same industry.
Right. It lets them band together to buy insurance like a giant corporation would. And in theory, that massive group should get lower premiums and have lower administrative costs.
But there's a catch.
There's always a catch. The controversy is that AHPs can often bypass some of the mandatory coverage requirements that the ACA put in place, which, Democrats argue, leads to what they call junk plans.
So, cheaper premiums, but maybe not the coverage you need if you get really sick.
That's the divide in a nutshell. Republicans call it consumer choice and market efficiency. Democrats call it deregulation that sacrifices patient protection.
And what was the third piece of the bill?
The third piece was codifying and strengthening what are called choice arrangements.
Okay, another technical term. What does that do?
It's pretty straightforward, actually. It lets an employee who's buying their own individual health plan pay for those premiums with pre-tax money.
So it's an immediate tax break. It makes the coverage they already have cheaper, but without a new federal subsidy.
Exactly. And that distinction, subsidies versus market mechanisms, was a huge part of the Republican attack. They were very clear that the original ACA subsidies are not expiring.
Right. It's only the enhanced tax credits, the APTCs, that were boosted during the pandemic.
The ones the Democrats passed in 2021 as a COVID measure. And this is where they brought in the fraud argument. They cited a GAO report,
The Government Accountability Office.
and according to them, the report confirmed significant fraud tied to those enhanced credits.
And what kind of fraud were they talking about?
Well, the report detailed things like consumers being enrolled in plans without their consent or having their plans switched without their knowledge.
Which leads to wasted money, obviously, but also real harm to people who suddenly face unexpected costs or lose their doctor.
Right. So the argument was that this temporary, poorly monitored expansion was just fiscally irresponsible and was actually hurting people.
Now, let's flip the coin. The Democratic response painted a very dark picture.
They called it the Republican healthcare crisis. They accused Republicans of deliberately choosing to raise costs by letting those enhanced credits expire.
And the numbers they used were huge. They claimed that letting them expire would double, triple, even quadruple premiums for some people.
Up to $1,000 a month, they said, for 22 million people.
And they were careful to point out who these people are, not just the poor, but independent contractors, freelancers, small business owners, retirees.
The very same people that AHPs and choice arrangements are also supposedly trying to help. It's two completely different philosophies on how to solve the same problem.
They really hammered the message that Republicans were prioritizing, quote, permanent tax breaks for people who make over $500,000 a year.
While expecting a middle-class family of four making, I think the example was $129,000 a year, to just absorb these massive premium hikes.
Mrs. Adams of North Carolina made a really powerful moral point, too. She brought up the statistic that 68,000 Americans die every year because they don't have health insurance.
So it wasn't just a debate about policy for them. It was framed as a life-and-death struggle over government priorities.
And they tried to do something about it, procedurally. Ms. Scanlon from Pennsylvania, she tried to defeat what's called the previous question.
Which is a key procedural vote. It's a bit in the weeds, but basically if she had succeeded, it would have allowed her to offer an amendment.
An amendment to extend those enhanced tax credits through 2028.
But it failed. The vote was close, 215 to 207, but the Republican bill stayed on track. And it's a perfect example of how these fights are so often won or lost on procedure before you even get to the substance.
Okay, so that's healthcare. But right after that, the debate shifted to immigration and border policy, and it was, if anything, even more intense.
Equally divided for sure. We looked at two really contentious bills. The first was H.R. 4371, the Kayla Hamilton Act. This is all about unaccompanied alien children, or UACs.
The proponents, like Mr. FRY, they framed this as a necessary bill to prevent tragedies.
Right. The goal is to make background checks for the sponsors of these children much more rigorous. Criminal checks, sex offender registry checks.
And it also would prevent placing these children with sponsors who are undocumented themselves, who lack what they call immigration permanence.
The idea being that the sponsor needs to be legally established to provide a safe and stable home. They also pushed back on the idea that these kids are being imprisoned, saying they're only held for a few weeks or months while their cases are processed.
But the opponents saw this bill in a completely different light. They called it doubling down on cruelty.
And weaponizing tragedies for political gain. Mrs. Jayapal and Mrs. Ramirez were very vocal. They attacked provisions they found just abhorrent.
And like subjecting kids as young as 12 to invasive exams, even strip searches to look for gang tattoos.
And forcing them into what they called prison-like secure facilities.
They used a really specific and frankly shocking anecdote to make their point.
The story of Jersa Reyes Barrios, a professional soccer player who was tortured by the Maduro regime in Venezuela. He was allegedly labeled as a member of this dangerous gang, Tren de Aragua.
Just because he had a Real Madrid soccer logo tattoo.
Exactly. It's an anecdote designed to show the incredible danger of relying on these arbitrary signs to justify invasive procedures and detention.
Mrs. Ramirez also called out what she saw as the religious hypocrisy of the whole debate.
She did. She said it was despicable to pursue these, quote, new cruel punishments for child refugees, while at the same time quoting scripture about how precious children are.
The second bill was maybe the most culturally charged one of the week. H.R. 3492, the Protect Children's Innocence Act.
This is the one concerning gender-affirming care for minors.
Proponents, like Mr. Moore of Alabama, they frame this bill as very simple, a moral necessity to leave our children alone.
And don't force children into making decisions that they will not be able to reverse. The rhetoric got very, very strong. They called these procedures genital-destroying child abuse and a mind virus.
So what does the bill actually do?
It prohibits a long list of specific medical procedures for minors castration, mastectomy, hysterectomy, and so on, and it establishes federal jurisdiction through interstate commerce.
Meaning if a doctor travels across state lines or uses medicine made out of state, it falls under the federal ban.
Right. But the opposition, led by Mr. Raskin, countered just as forcefully, and they did it by quoting the entire mainstream medical community.
He read from statements from professional medical organizations that were lobbying against the bill.
They called it a direct threat to patient welfare that would criminalize and dismantle health care for transgender young people.
So his argument was that this policy isn't supported by families, by doctors, or by the scientific community.
And that it represents the government just barging into private family decisions. He also pointed out that when these medical groups speak out, the other side calls them satanic, which really highlights the extremity of the rhetoric.
So if you take a step back and look at this whole section of the debate, from healthcare subsidies to refugee children to gender identity, it's clear these aren't just policy disagreements.
Not at all. They're fundamental battles over morality, over identity, and these deep existential disagreements about what the role of government should even be. And remember, while all this was happening,
At the exact same time, Congress was also passing legislation to help a small county get a building for a 4-H club.
the duality of Capitol Hill is relentless.
Let's pull away from that high-octane conflict for a minute and look at where the legislative machine actually works pretty well, addressing local needs. Because it's so important to remember that this detailed, local, often completely bipartisan work was also being enshrined in the record.
This is where we see the rubber really meet the road. Connecting abstract policy to, shellfish beds and local hospitals, it's proof that members of Congress are still deeply connected to their districts, even if the national news obscures it.
Let's start with environmental policy, H.R. 3962, the Estuaries Act.
Right, so this bill reauthorizes competitive grants for estuaries of national significance. It extends the program out to 2031.
And that long-term reauthorization is key because these are complex projects. Local groups need that funding certainty to be able to plan.
And the arguments for passing it were just beautifully focused on community impact and economic returns. Speakers Figures and Bonamici highlighted how the National Estuary Program, the NEP, works on the ground.
In New England, for instance, these programs have helped bring back crucial shellfish beds,
which, as they said, sustain entire working waterfronts. That's the local food economy, it's tourism, it's jobs.
And then on the Gulf Coast, they talked about how NEP projects have rebuilt marshes that literally shield frontline communities from hurricanes.
That's not just environmentalism. That's economic security. It's disaster mitigation that saves lives and saves billions in federal recovery money later on. The whole idea is giving local experts the tools and the long-term funding they need to protect the ecosystems that ultimately protect us.
Then we saw a perfect, totally bipartisan example of transforming federal waste into a local opportunity. This was a bill about a federal site in Perry County, Arkansas.
The situation was simple. There was this idle, deteriorating federal building. It was an expense. It was an eyesore for the federal government.
But for Perry County, it was a golden opportunity.
Because they had a plan for it. They want to renovate it and turn it into a hub for 3 crucial community services: the University of Arkansas Extension Program, the Perry County Conservation District, and the 4-H youth programs.
So you take a decaying federal liability and you turn it into a center for education and conservation.
It's a textbook example of good government, and the conveyance would be at no cost to the county, other than some administrative fees. It just makes common sense.
The EOR also gave us this unique window into key regional industries. Ms. Capture of Ohio submitted some really extensive remarks about the state's corn and soy farmers.
She talked about the huge local impact of biofuels. She noted that biofuels now make up over 44% of the income for farmers in Northwest Ohio.
44%, that's massive.
It's a critical stability mechanism for them, especially as they lose other export markets because of tariffs and trade disputes. Biofuels are a reliable source of income.
Ms. Capture also highlighted local infrastructure in the Great Lakes region, which is another area that often gets overlooked in the national debate.
She pointed out that MARAD, the Maritime Administration, supports 13 public and 50 commercial ports just in the Great Lakes.
And she got really specific on the local economic benefit. In Northwest Ohio, the ports of Toledo and Sandusky Harbor generate almost $900 million a year in economic activity, and support 8,000 jobs.
She even mentioned a specific recent win a $10.3 million grant for the South Bass Island and Put-in-Bay Port Authority. Very local, very tangible.
And finally, the EOR is just this treasure trove of local tributes. We saw a connection between military readiness and community safety in a tribute to Graham County, North Carolina.
The EOR detailed a successful drug operation there, and the purpose was to explicitly thank Sheriff Brad Hoxett and his department. The representative said the operation brings renewed hope and reassurance to the community.
We also saw several other really poignant tributes. Mr. Carter of Georgia recognized Tybee Island as the #1 winter fishing spot for 2026.
Mr. Messmer from Indiana honored Rob McClenn on his retirement after 34 years at Good Samaritan Hospital in Vincennes.
15 of those years as president and CEO. Imagine.
A lifetime of service. Then you had Mr. Tony Gonzalez of Texas honoring a 97-year-old WWII Korean and Vietnam War veteran named Raymond Falk.
And Mrs. Jerez from Washington honored the former mayor of Tacoma, Victoria Woodards, and listed this incredible string of her achievements.
From police reform to housing expansion to one of the nation's first guaranteed income pilots.
It just cements the idea, doesn't it? While policy divides, acknowledging community impact can still unite. For the learner, the EOR is probably the truest reflection of a Congress member's day-to-day focus when they're not in Washington.
Okay, so to really understand how legislation lives or dies, especially when time is short, you have to look past the title of the bill and look at the procedures.
As we've been saying, Congress doesn't just vote on bills, it votes on procedures. And this week, the Senate gave us a masterclass in two of the most powerful ones: cloture and the threat of a unanimous consent hold.
Let's start with the ideal scenario, a mechanism that actually worked. The National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA. This is the massive, must-pass bill that funds the entire military.
Right. And even though it's huge and has tons of controversial parts, the Senate needed to get it done, so they used a motion to close debate, which is known as cloture.
We should define that for the listener. What does cloture actually do, in simple terms?
It's the way you break a filibuster. It ends a debate on a bill and forces a final vote, but you need 60 senators to agree to it. And getting 60 votes on anything controversial these days is, well, it's really hard.
Which is what makes the result of this vote so telling. The cloture motion passed 76-20.
76. That's an overwhelming margin. It shows a really strong bipartisan will to get this defense bill done, no matter what other disagreements they have.
The final passage was almost identical, 77-20, so that's the functional path. Now let's contrast that with the Senate's other favorite tool, the legislative hold.
Which is often done by objecting to a unanimous consent request, or UC.
This is where the power of a single senator becomes almost absolute. What is unanimous consent?
It's the fast track. It's how they move non-controversial bills. The leader just asks for UC, and if nobody objects, the bill passes instantly. No vote, no debate.
But any single senator can object.
Huh?
And that objection acts as a hold. It kills the fast track and basically sentences the bill to a slow procedural death.
And we saw this play out. A bunch of truly non-controversial bills, like one helping Native American tourism, they sailed through on UC. But when bills came over from the House, the gridlock was back.
And Senator Sheetsy gave a perfect example of how the hold becomes a weapon. He stood up and made a very specific threat. He said he would object to any more House Republican public lands bills.
Until the House agrees to pass some of the Senate Democrats' public lands bills.
It's the transactional nature of the Senate floor laid bare. He's using his procedural power to choke off one category of legislation to force the other side to negotiate on his priorities.
It's why some bills with widespread support can just languish for months. It has nothing to do with their merit. They're just being used as a bargaining chip in a bigger game.
We did see some things break through, though. The reauthorization of the Civil Rights Cold Case Records Collection Act passed the Senate with unanimous support.
A much-needed breath of fresh air, as one senator called it.
Which suggests that consensus is still possible when an issue is framed around historical justice and shared values, rather than current partisan fights over resources.
All right, moves back to the high conflict zone. Here's where the floor debate meets international relations. The House took up a resolution to challenge the president's authority on military action in Venezuela.
Right. This was H-Con Res. 64, and it was a direct use of the War Powers Resolution. It would direct the president to stop all military hostilities within or against Venezuela unless Congress specifically authorized them.
And this was a reaction to some specific actions the administration had taken.
Boat bombings, strikes against alleged narco-traffickers in the Caribbean, seizing a Venezuelan oil tanker, threats of a naval blockade.
The debate was, as you expect, deeply polarized. The opponents of the resolution, so the ones who supported the president's actions, people like Mr. Bass and Mr. Gimenez, they framed it as a necessary defense against narco-terrorism.
They argued that cartels are exploiting the border crisis and posing a direct threat to the homeland. Mr. Mast even brought up an American rancher who was killed in Texas by a cartel IED.
Their argument was that the resolution was a dangerous limitation on the president's power as commander-in-chief. That weakness invites aggression.
But the proponents of the resolution, those wanting to curb the president's power, like Mr. Thompson, Mr. Meeks, and Mr. Castro, they used much stronger language. They called the strikes illegal under U.S. and international laws.
Some even called them war crimes.
And a big part of their argument was about transparency and accountability. They demanded the administration release the full, unedited video of one of the strikes, claiming the government was hiding what really happened.
Mr. Meeks also made it political, questioning why the president was so focused on fighting drug dealers when he had previously pardoned a convicted narco-terrorist.
And Mr. Castro warned that the president was provoking a new war right in our backyard and that Congress needed to reassert its constitutional war powers. It's a fundamental conflict. Immediate defense versus constitutional process.
Now, let's circle back to the NDA, the defense bill we talked about procedurally, because it also had a critical national security component related to domestic infrastructure, aviation safety.
Specifically, safety at really congested mixed-use airports like DCA, right there in Washington, D.C.
The problem was that the House version of the bill had included some language that was widely seen as a step backward for safety.
The concern was so severe that the chair of the NTSB, Jennifer Homendy, took what she called the unprecedented step of publicly stating that the NDA was not adequately addressing the safety concerns at DCA.
That's a huge deal. A safety regulator publicly calling out a major must-pass bill.
And that challenge forced a bipartisan fix in the Senate. It was an amendment, number 4070, led by Senators Cruz and Cantwell. It's known as the Rotor Act fix.
And what did that fix do?
Several really important technical things. First, it requires all aircraft in that airspace, civilian and military, to have and use something called ADS-B signals.
Let's quickly define ADS-B.
It's an anti-collision technology. The in function is the equipment on the plane that receives signals from other aircraft, so the pilot can see exactly where everyone else is in real time. Mandating it for everyone in a crowded space like DCA is a huge safety improvement.
The fix also directs the FAA to evaluate other airports around the country for similar collision risks.
And finally, it forces better information sharing between the FAA and the military, breaking down those bureaucratic silos that can contribute to accidents. It's a great example of Congress, when faced with a serious safety issue, moving quickly and technically to get it right.
So what does all of this mean when we put it together? Our deep dive into the record this week really shows a government that is defined by high tension, but is still capable of high functioning.
Albeit in these separate, very contradictory spheres, we've traced this dramatic tension between the call for civility, with former members warning of Civil War-level polarization, and the brutal legislative warfare playing out over things like healthcare and the border.
And we've seen how that tension shapes what actually gets done. Congress often works by pairing these popular bipartisan local bills like giving a building to Perry County for a 4-H club with the highly controversial major policy fights.
The process itself is a key part of the battle, whether it's that failed procedural vote in the House, the cloture motion in the Senate, or the threat of a UC hold. The mechanics are where the priorities are fought over.
And remember, this is all grounded in the Congressional Record, which you can look up yourself. All the specific tributes, the roll call votes, the legislative language for bills like H.R. 6703 or the Rotor Act. It's all there if you look up the record for December 19th, 2025, and the few days before that at congress.gov.
But here's where it gets really interesting, and this is the thought we want to leave you with.
Throughout all these debates on both sides, you heard members talking about the affordability crisis, the struggle to pay for rent, groceries, and especially healthcare. They all agreed that was the biggest urgency facing Americans.
And yet, as we just saw, a vast amount of legislative energy was spent on these highly polarizing culture war issues and on procedural battles that ultimately failed to advance that core need for relief.
If the American people are begging for action on affordability, as one member put it,
The evidence in the record suggests that the very process we studied, the procedural warfare, the holds, the intense focus on identity politics, is exactly why the most urgent bills, like extending those affordability subsidies, often die or just get used as fodder in a bigger game.
So the question for Congress and for you is this. What will it take for the institution to align its debate priorities with the public's financial needs when the entire system seems engineered to prioritize conflict over consensus?
Because that affordability crisis remains the final unresolved conflict of this session. A compelling question for the new year. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Congress and context.